All right, in this part two of the lecture on Stalinism, we'll pick up where we left off. The last point had been that that under the five-year plans, that Stalin had said that there would be a constant struggle to achieve utopia, and that it would be a difficult process. Eventually, they would get there, but that there might be some bumps along the road. That would be a euphemistic way of saying that people might have to die for this to happen. Bear in mind now that because people had to make sacrifices for this, whether it was giving up land or living under harsh conditions or any of these things to lead to a better industrialization or quicker industrialization for the Soviet Union, that did actually contrast with members of the party bureaucracy like Stalin and other. The lifestyle of officials was very, very different from those at the bottom. And this had been the same case with Lenin and also with Trotsky as well. They had some fairly lavish places that they lived. They didn't want for any kind of food and often had quite nice food at that. And many of the party officials lived really nice lifestyles while many of the, or millions, I should say, of their fellow Russians died of starvation. Much of it imposed on them by Stalin himself. So there was a bit of discrepancy, but you could not actually speak about this discrepancy lest you run into some issues. In other words, you could be imprisoned or killed. Other things that Stalin does and as part of his process to bring Russia up to speed, the Soviet Union up to speed, is the forced collectivization of farms, which I'd mentioned earlier. This is where he took rural private property and split it into nationally owned mechanized farms that peasants would work collectively. They had to provide set quotas of government to the government of grain to feed particularly urban laborers and keep the factories running. Uh, and it was hoped that this would just be done voluntarily, as it would benefit the peasants who didn't have land. But the idea didn't catch on because many areas in the Soviet Union had a long tradition of at least small land ownership or small ownership of land, um, part of not only sustenance but their culture as well. So this is going to create some problems because a lot of peasants would resist. They'd refuse to turn over grain, or they would kill their own animals, as you saw in the video. And again, blaming enemies of the revolution, Stalin and the government began to force the process, forcibly moving people off of their land, sometimes even to completely new areas. Stalin sent tens of thousands of loyal urban communists and their proletarians to collect the surplus grain, to move people to new farms, arrest resistors, and send them to work in Siberia, in the Gulag, the Soviet concentration camps. A lot of scholars actually believe that these disruptions in the agricultural process are actually the cause of the Great Famine that the Soviet Union experienced in 1932 to 33. Stalin also made it illegal to leave a lot of these areas as well, if there was a famine. And this policy alone led to the death of millions. Um, this is part of the video that you saw, as well as the book talks about, which is his program of the liquidation of the kulaks. Remember that the kulaks were considered the sort of the slightly better off landowners and farmers out there. So they were ones who had a little bit of land, not just your average peasant small family, but maybe they owned a couple farms or a bit of land, and they were usually referred to the term kulak means tight-fisted. It was an idea that they would use against these individuals who were working against or they said were working against the collectivization and therefore against the Soviet Union. And so they were deemed enemies of the state and were in most cases simply liquidated. And that liquidation of the kulaks is the euphemistic term for they were murdered. Um, the low end is 3 million, the high end is 20 million. So average those out, so where you get around 10 million of his own citizens were murdered in the forced collectivization of the farms. It actually failed to increase agricultural production as drastically, nor did it modernize agriculture. In fact, it was mostly a failure. But that's not the way it was treated in the text and in the sources in the propaganda that you find. Here is one for those Russians or Soviets who would be illiterate potentially. Here you have, starting in the top left panel and moving across, you have the very well-to-do kulak, right? Notice how fat he is. He's fat and he's making these poor workers move all the grain that they take from the field in there. Notice the workers are wearing red so that they're these proto-communists, right? Making them take their, he's like the bourgeois industrial owner is to the proletariat workers in the Industrial Revolution, right? So he's forcing them to take the grain, put it in there, and apparently they can't do anything with it because in the second panel, everyone's lined up in a bread line, but there's no bread. Ultimately, it looks like two agitators listen to someone who's talking. Notice a person in the white shirt in the background there standing up. Someone is giving a speech, and these two would decide that they will run the kulak out of town. So they run him out of town. What do? Well, in the bottom panel there, apparently the stores are open. The grain is being brought back. There's even factories that are there with lots of grain. In the middle picture on the bottom, it looks like there's as much bread as they need. The store is stocked, and so much so that the store owner is showing, hey, we've got extra bread. You can even take this one here. And then you have the nice sort of domestic scene there where the child is learning to read, the mother is sewing, the father is repairing shoes because they're all these good workers working in the collective. And this was the way to try to give a positive spin to removing owners who didn't want to give up their land. Now, Stalin ran into some problems. He instituted his own version of the terror. We've seen this in the French Revolution. We've seen it under Napoleon. And this is what we call the Great Purge. In the 1930s, in order to consolidate his power, Stalin began purging a whole bunch of other enemies. And these were often, so he'd focused on kulaks before, he'd gotten rid of Trotsky. But these were important high-level officials that threatened his authority. And this wasn't without precedent. We've seen this in the October Revolution, in the Red Terror, at the beginning of the process of collectivization. But it was on a much larger scale and affected even the inner party itself. So some of them were, some of those people who were purged were, people who had been in positions like Trotsky, but it was also former officers of the Red Army, many of whom were accused of treason or somehow working with the enemies of the Soviet Union. And so anytime that there was, for example, a grain shortage, so Stalin said, hey, we wanted more grain, we needed to get more agricultural produce here, but unfortunately we couldn't. So rather than simply saying that they failed, they blamed any of those shortages on saboteurs. Then you have a whole series of purges within the army itself. You have, remember Trotsky has to flee. He hadn't been part of the army by this point, but Trotsky has to flee because of the importance that he had. He fled in exile to Mexico, where Stalin sent an agent and had him assassinated. We saw that Stalin had tried to remove Trotsky from these images, but he also purges political dissidents and others that he refers to as counter-revolutionaries. And these are where you get some of these crazy stories of elderly individuals who unfortunately happen to have a book that has a picture of Trotsky in it, and therefore they are put on trial and executed. So it's not just Stalin, it was ordinary people could report on others to protect yourself, maybe to enact revenge, very similar to the terror under the French Revolution. And what Stalin did then is he put together a series of what are known as show trials, so that he would put these trials on to make it look like there was evidence against these people. It wasn't just simply Stalin killing them. He would put evidence against them, and then what they would do is often they would confess after probably having been tortured, so that the public could point to, Stalin and others could point to these and say that, no, look, we didn't make this up. These individuals actually confessed. And why would they confess if they weren't guilty? So big show trials, and the idea is this constantly reinforced this idea that there were saboteurs, that there were counter-revolutionaries who were always out there trying to undercut the Russian Revolution and destroy the state. And they could happen at the highest levels of government, so therefore you did need a secret police. You did need a place to put them. So military leaders can fall under it, and many of those who ended up doing this or being accused of this were, if they weren't executed, they were, well, almost executed, which is they were sent to the Gulag. The Gulag are the Soviet prison camps, their version of concentration camps. Many of them were forced labor camps as well. And most of these take place by 1938, where Stalin had purged most of his enemies. He had killed millions, or exiled or sent to forced labor camps in places like Siberia and Central Asia and underpopulated regions of the far empire. They purges ultimately around 1938 or so. Most of them begin to stop, although they will continue on and off every so often, but the main ones are done so that by 1938, Stalin is absolutely in control. Um, I should point out that in the Gulag system, now this is separate from the collectivization, right, which could kill anywhere from like 3 to 20 million people. Here in the Gulag, it could be, we think some of the numbers are around 10 million people being imprisoned and 3 million dying. So that puts, even if you take the low number from the other figures and stuff, we're still looking at about 13 to 15 million so far killed under Stalin. The numbers are probably a little bit higher as well. But 10 million people imprisoned. I mean, it's an insane amount of people imprisoned. Here's a map showing you the extent of the Soviet Union that you see in the center of the map there. And the map is in French, but you can see Moscow is over to the far left, sort of upper corner. There's Moscow, Leningrad there. That's in the west. That's sort of the industrialized area that's closer to Europe. But what you see on there are the small little ones, the small little squares are corrective work camps. The larger squares are groups of labor camps. And what you have is you can see the Trans-Siberian Railroad that leaves Moscow. It goes through Samara. It goes all the way out to the southern regions of Siberia. It goes all the way out to the Aral Sea. And then you have, notice the biggest camp that I mean, all of these are in sort of very remote areas. Then you have this major camp, Kloima, all the way out by the far sea on the far, in this case, the far eastern part of Russia, way out in the middle of Siberia. As these are terrible conditions that exist in these camps, forced labor, most people die who go there, or a lot of people die who go there because they have to work so hard and so long in terrible freezing conditions of Siberia. Now, despite the terrible system or the situation in the Gulag, Stalin tried to make sure that everyone thought that everything was great under him, and he used a lot of propaganda in order to do this. Not just the kind of propaganda we saw by getting the pictures of Trotsky out of media, but in some of these cases, here you have a series of banners that start with that have Marx and Engels, the two writers of the Communist Manifesto, then Lenin, then Stalin. Of course, the idea being that the founders of the ideas of communism developed into Lenin, then culminate into Stalin. And I know the picture is kind of fuzzy, but if you notice, you can see all of these different people in the pictures, particularly under the picture of Stalin. The implication is, of course, that the whole of the Soviet people support Stalin in his endeavors, because all he's really doing is just trying to help the Soviet Union, according to his propaganda. And here's an example, too, right? Where basically, in 1952, here's a picture of Stalin in his quasi-military dress there, with all of these Soviet citizens behind him, and he has some sort of paper there, and it says, "We are for peace." Doesn't mean that he is, and that doesn't really account for the 15 million people who were killed, but he can give that message that he's just simply for peace. Or he can do images like this, where he says, has children saluting him, and they look all happy and healthy, and Stalin's looking over them, and they say, "Thank you, dear Stalin, for a happy childhood." Right? How could a guy like this be responsible for 15 million people being sent to the Gulag? That was the message, of course, right? He wouldn't do terrible things like that. Everything he's doing is for the betterment of the Soviet Union. Here's Stalin casting a vote, right? It can't be a complete dictatorship and totalitarian regime if people can vote. And there's Stalin casting a vote. Says nothing, of course, of the votes being rigged or anything, but still, Stalin was trying to portray this image of him as bringing order, but and allowing votes in this case in some sort of democratic process. It wasn't really the case. Here, Stalin's care brightens the future of our children. Again, reinforcing the notion that Stalin is, whatever Stalin does is done for the good of the Soviet people. Here's another one of Stalin bringing all sorts of things to the mass of Soviets. Notice the variety of ethnicities as well, because the Soviet Union is very vast. You can see the cityscape starting on the left behind him. You can see on the map as well that it's divided up into these grids. There are electrical towers on the right side at the beginning of the map. The idea is that he's modernized this. They all, of course, look up to him. They're all very happy with it. No indication of the camps here. Right? The image simply covers over the fact of what Stalin has actually done in order to achieve this modernization process. Yes, he's brought it into the modern age, but millions of people had to die. Now, contrast that, of course, with what you see in this image here, which very much contradicts Stalin's image of this glorious Russia where everything has been modernized and everybody is happy. This is the reality behind that sort of propaganda. And that's where we'll end the discussion of Stalin.